I'm going to talk about personality in general first, just so you guys have a rough idea of what exactly we're talking about, and then I'm going to transfer over into talking about personality disorders. So, blah, 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 we don't need to read that. So, the reason I'm doing my presentation on this is because there's a debate right now in the field of personalities. So, we've got this schism going on between mostly psychiatrists and like psychometrician trait theorist types. So it's an interesting area to look at, to research in. I turn the lights on. One thing that helps me when I'm doing a presentation is if I can look and kind of see your eyes. You know, if I look at one of you and you're kind of looking down or something like that, it's like, oh, I don't get the response that I'm looking for. And I just don't feel like I'm in the right place when I do that. So I'm not really going to read the text I'm not going to read all of the text because it's going to be boring. So, the diagnosis of personality disorders, so it's going to be abbreviated PD, is undergoing a transition from the categorical structure, which is like mental illness, mental disorders, to a dimensional model, which is really similar to autism spectrum disorder. So, I'll give you some history on personality in general. So, psychiatry as a medical science began in the 18th century. So Franz Joseph Gall was a German physician. He was one of the first people to try and describe personality. He described it through this topic called phrenology. So phrenology is basically the mapping of like the leaps and bounds on someone's skull. So this is old, and people make fun of that nowadays. So I'll show you. So here's an example of it. So this is kind of what they thought. So, like, a good husband has sort of a regular curvature to the back of his head, and a bad husband's kind of squared off. So, it's really actually interesting how they formulated this. But people make fun of this all the time. It's pretty silly. But the idea that cognitive function and personality can be localized is actually smart. But they didn't quite get the mapping right. You know, it's in the brain maybe, or in the body, not necessarily on top of the skull. So I'm going to skip this stuff. It's not as interesting. So, Theodore Rivet, a French psychologist, began working on personality, and he was working more on the abnormal side, the things that are, problematic. So, modern dimensional systems of personality are based on sort of the statistical mathematical equations of trait adjectives. So originally this was done by Gordon Allport. So he assumed, maybe rightfully so, that personality would actually be encapsulated in language. So he thought of it as you could use adjectives to figure out the fundamental dimensions of personality. So I think he took around 17 or 18,000. I have 18,000 written in here. I don't remember exactly. I think it was more closer to 17,000. He took 17,000 trait descriptors and reduced them to 4,500. So that's still quite a bit. And you can't really take all those terms and give them to a bunch of people and have them rate themselves on that scale. So Raymond Cattell came along later. He believed that psychology should be based on measurements and statistics and things like that. So this happened probably about mid-1960s as far as I can tell. So Raymond Cattell, he was one of the people who figured out, quite a bit about IQ and intelligence in general. He was one of the top 3, if not the top scientists studying that. So, interestingly, with personality, there was no negative adjectives at all in the statistical analyses. So they didn't use words like antisocial or vengeful. They used things like fun or caring or hardworking or diligent to describe people because they didn't want to have any bias in there. So in the 1960s, a social psychologist came along. His name was Walter Mischel. He looked at personality, and he was sort of interested in the area of personality that allowed you to predict something. So he wanted personality to be actually useful. So he looked at personality and said, well, personality measurements only give you about a correlation coefficient of about 0.2, which has actually remained relatively stable, by the way. It's probably about 0.25 if you control for measurement error. So he took 0.25 squared, and then that would be 4%. So he said, well, personality predicts 4% of the variance, which leaves 96% of the variance unaccounted for. So he said, well, there's no point in using personality for anything. And this killed the field of personality from the trait standpoint, at least until the 1990s. I wish I had brought up the actual economic calculations that came about after this. So I think in like 1993, there were economic calculations for hiring employees that were above average in trait conscientiousness. And those employees, if you hire employees who are conscientious, they will make more money for the company than what you're paying them in salary. And that changed the field of personality in the 1990s. So it's really quite interesting, I think.
Yeah.
There's a area in psychology, the performance prediction end of it, which is really, really interesting and valuable. While this was happening, two people, Robert Hare and Dr. Delroy Paulus, who are both in Canada, were working on abnormal personalities. So I'm going to skip a lot of this stuff. So we're at the halfway point in my presentation now. So I'm going to start talking about personality disorders in particular. So in 1980, the third edition of the DSM came out, and the work groups on the third edition put personality disorders in what's called Axis 2. So they had various personality disorders, and then they put the intellectual disabilities in there. So that's kind of how they actually thought of those. But personality disorders have had sort of a rough past. There's a couple of problems with them. So the first problem is, if you're diagnosed with a personality disorder, you are very likely to be diagnosed with multiple other personality disorders, which is a problem because it's like, well, if you have borderline personality disorder and you have histrionic personality disorder, what's the difference between those two? So that was kind of the biggest thing. Of course, there were other problems with the diagnoses themselves. But so there's three different clusters now, and I think this actually happened in the DSM-4. But in the DSM-5, so you got cluster A, which is odd eccentric, cluster B, which is dramatic emotional is the words that I use, and then cluster C, which is anxious and fearful. So and an interesting way to think about this is you can kind of think about mental disorders in general and fit them into these. So for example, you've got odd eccentric, so maybe you would put schizophrenia in here, and
autistic.
You could put autism spectrum disorder in there. Those sorts of like old world mental disorders. So dramatic emotional would be things like you could put in borderline and histrionic personality disorder and some other things. And then, anxious and fearful would be anxiety, major depressive disorder. So you can actually think about, and that's kind of how I think about mental illness. There's kind of three different classifications of it. So for time's sake, I'm not going to get deep into the descriptions of each personality disorder. It isn't that important for this. So, but I will kind of list off a couple. So paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal. So those are all three of the cluster A personality disorders. So cluster B personality disorders are borderline personality disorder, histrionic, narcissistic, and antisocial personality disorder. So then I actually don't have it written in here, I don't think, but the cluster C personality disorders are like obsessive compulsive personality disorder, those sorts of things. So one of the problems with the cluster B personality disorders, which makes them different from everything in the DSM-5, is they're actually considered acting out disorders. So everything else causes some discomfort for the person who has the mental disorder. So the acting out disorders are different in that they cause other people pain. So Antisocial personality disorder, that's sort of like this area where the psychopath lives, you know. Borderline personality disorder is sort of the female variant of that. These can actually be divided by sexes pretty reliably, which I find to be quite interesting. So,
which is most common, cluster A, B, or C?
one of the problems with trying to categorize things like that is you end up with such an overlap.
Okay.
So the disorders that are most common will kind of clump together, and then the things that are least common will kind of clump down over here. I would say generally the most common personality disorders are the anxious, fearful
C.
group. Yeah, because they're another good way to think about these disorders is they're, with the exception of cluster B the cluster B personality disorders, the acting out disorders, is personality disorders are sort of like, I think of them as subclinical manifestations of regular mental disorders. That's all, you know. And so what the work groups did is they took in a bunch of people that weren't mentally ill before. They said, well, now you're going to be mentally ill, and don't get me wrong, labeling's helpful for people. I mean, if you've got somebody with an anxiety disorder, you know, you could say, okay, well, you have this anxiety disorder. Here's an online group of 10,000 other people who have it. We kind of understand it. Here's kind of what your treatment options are, and here's how people get better. And I tell you what, that person's categorized, but they breathe a great sign of relief.
Because they have a path.
Yeah, they have a path, you know. And knowing what you have is a hell of a lot better than not knowing what you don't have, you know?
Right.
So that's sort of important. And people kind of leave that out. People like Thomas Saz, who wrote The Myth of Mental Illness, you know, he didn't consider that. But it's actually helpful for people. So perfect. So I talked earlier that there were sort of two views for looking at personality disorders. There's a categorical, like DSM, well, they're now the DSM-5, the categorical models, and then the other one, which was, I guess we're going to call it the spectrum. So there was the DSM categories, and then there's the alternate model of personality disorders, which are sort of the fluid, very similar to autism spectrum disorder. So, okay, how should we look at personality disorders? So I would say generally the dimensional model with the spectrum is going to be better. One of the reasons that I think this is so is because it's much more scientifically rigorous. Now, the categorical psychiatry route I think is valuable. It makes things simpler. It's much easier to say, well, you have this mental disorder, and here's what the treatment options are. But it isn't specific enough because, like I said, lots of people will have multiple mental disorders, and you know, if they have more than one, hard to say what you should do about that. So that's what I would say about that. The other thing about the cluster B personality disorders is they're very resistant to treatment. I'm a believer that you can't successfully treat someone simply medicating them if they're not interested in any treatment. So people with cluster B personality disorders generally aren't interested in going to treatment and maintaining what they need to do. So, and there also isn't any medication that actually works for them. So I've always thought about the cluster B personality disorders in general as inappropriate manifestations of bad behavior. I really don't think they're mental disorders. I think that those people who have those disorders need to behave better. And that's not a very popular thing to say, but I definitely think it's true.